Hello everyone, my name is Mrs. Ray and I'm going to be doing the session with you today on psychology. I hope it gives you a bit of an idea about what psychology is, what studying A-level psychology involves, and also gives you a little bit of a taster session. If you're listening to this, you've already worked out that you need to click on the speaker icon in the bottom right hand corner on all the slides to hear the audio. So let's start with this. Thinking about some of the common myths and misconceptions about psychology. So first of all, psychology is a science. It does involve scientific research. So it is classed by the Qualifications Council as a science. And if you choose to study psychology at A-level, you will be using a lot of the terminology that you use in the other sciences. So phrases like hypothesis, controlled variables, lab experiments, etc. As part of that, obviously we then need to scientifically analyse the data. So just be prepared for the fact that there is a data analysis element in the research methods section of our course. The second one, on the true side, psychology is about understanding people. Don't choose to study psychology unless you are genuinely interested in what makes people tick, what makes us perform particular actions, what helps to formulate our attitudes and opinions and thought processes. Thirdly, psychology is about studying the human mind and its functions. So if you think about what the word psychology means, we can split it up into psych, which means mind, and the ology part is the study of. So it's the study of the human mind and the way that all of the functions within the human mind perform and work together to make us who we are. Now just be a little bit careful there, because it doesn't say psychology is about studying the human brain. The brain and the mind are obviously linked, but they are slightly different. So the brain is the biological organ that you have. The mind is focusing much more on thought processes. Now, finally, on the true side, so thought processes, mental processes are important to psychology, but so is behaviour as well, because obviously the behaviour is what emanates from the thought processes. Now, thinking about the false, psychology is about psychiatry and mental illness. Be careful, because you shouldn't take psychology thinking that the majority of the course is studying mental illness. We'll see a little bit later, it's actually there's actually only two topics in the course that are focusing on mental health. So just be mindful of that when you're choosing your A-level courses. Psychology isn't psychiatry either. So psychiatrists are medically trained doctors who go on to specialise in the field of mental health. So they approach mental health from a medical perspective, whereas psychologists don't. They are more interested in some of the other factors, like your childhood experiences, factors within the environment, culture, that impact on the way that we think. Psychology also is quite heavy in terms of its written content. So don't take this course if you think it's going to mainly involve sitting around having a discussion. There's a little bit of debate in psychology, but you'll find that the majority of the lessons you'll be writing down theories, and then we'll be analysing those theories, so thinking about the advantages and disadvantages of them. And the third point on there, psychologists can't read your mind. We will not be teaching you to read people's minds, but what you will gain from psychology is an insight into predictive behaviours. And we do think a little bit about body language and what body language indicates. So we're going to move on to our taster session now, and then I'll come back a bit later on to thinking about the structure of the course and what it involves. So perception is the topic that I've chosen for the taster session today. This is the process of taking information in through our senses, and obviously we have 5 senses, don't we? So touch, taste, smell, sight, and hearing. Now we obviously take information in through sense receptors. That information then goes to the brain, which processes it and makes sense of it. So really, if you think about it, perception is the first stage of thinking. We're taking in a huge amount of physical information from the environment around us through our many sense receptors, but we can only attend to a very limited amount of it. And then the brain needs to make sense of what we do take into into the brain and make it into something meaningful. So let's think about the stages involved in perception. How do we convert this physical information into an experience of the world around us? So our sense organs contain receptors, for example your taste buds, and these will detect physical properties of the world. That information will then be sent to the brain via the central nervous system, and the brain will then interpret that information as our perceptual experiences of the world. So it's this highly developed system. It's more than just registering physical sensations. We have got to make sense of the information that we are receiving. Now, there's been a lot of research into visual illusions, and that's what we're going to have a look at in this session today. So before we have a look at what psychologists have found about perception from visual illusions, I just want to think about the difference between vision and perception. So vision is the biological process that happens in your eyes. So obviously your eyes work by detecting rays of light that are reflected or emitted by different objects. Perception is different. Perception is not the biological process, it's the psychological process. So this is what happens in your brain. It's the time when your brain is making sense of a visual image that's been detected by the eye. So it's thinking about how does physical energy form the basis of a perceptual experience. So just reflect back to what you know about the structure of the eye from your GCSE studies. So light is reflected from an object, it enters the eye and it makes an image on the retina, which is obviously that back layer of the eye. The retina, you'll remember, is covered with thousands of light detecting cells, which we call rods and cones. When the retina detects light, it then sends nerve impulses to the brain. And there's a particular pathway in the brain that's used here. The nerve impulses travel from the eye along what's called the optic nerve, which is a thick bundle of nerve cells that head from the back of the eye, and they go to the back of your brain to an area called the visual cortex or the occipital lobe. Once the occipital lobe receives that information, that's when the information can be interpreted. So what you can see in the picture here is the location of the visual cortex, or occipital lobe as it's also known. So we have a visual cortex in each half of the brain. The brain is divided into two, and each half is called a hemisphere, and you'll have a visual part of each hemisphere for processing information. It's only once information gets to this part of the brain that we can truly understand things like shape, colour and distance, and that's a relatively slow part of the process of perception. So my objective in this taster session is to really illustrate to you the fact that perception or perceiving is very different from seeing. So perception is different from vision. Psychologists have shown this to be true numerous times, and I'm hopefully going to illustrate it to you using a series of visual illusions. Follow the instructions at the top of each slide and then listen to the audio. The first lesson that we can learn from psychological research is that the brain is incredibly lazy. It's a real cheat. It will do the minimum amount of processing possible, and it likes to do it quickly. And what it draws on is something called schema to interpret what we see. Now, schema are basically packages of information that we've learnt from experience, and stereotypes are quite a good example of them. We make very quick judgments of people based on perhaps what they're wearing. Hopefully you've had a good go at reading this and you've managed to read it relatively quickly. It's a really good illustration of the fact that the brain is really lazy. Reading, as you know, is a well-learned ability for many people. And what happens when we read is we expect to find meaningful words. And so we don't actually read all of the word. We don't read every single letter within a word once we've learnt to read, because our schema or our past experience of reading tells us what we expect to be there, the most likely interpretation, without us having to make a huge amount of tremendous effort. And as it says there, as long as you've got the first and the last letter, you're still actually able to read most things without too much of a problem. Let's have a think about this one. So I would predict that the vast majority of you read aloud "a bird in the hand." If you really look at it properly, it doesn't say that. It says "a bird in the hand." Now this is a really good illustration of how our schema will guide our perception. So visually, our eyes will have picked up the word "the" twice. But in terms of our brain doesn't expect to see the, and so it tells us that it's only been printed once. I would imagine that quite a few of you have seen this image before. It's called the Rubin vase. And what happens here is we alternate between seeing a vase and the two faces. And the brain is trying to use the least amount of processing that it can do. And what happens here is we have a perceptual switch between alternative explanations, and the brain's desperately trying to make it meaningful. And it tends to use familiar objects to help us to make sense of what we see, and that's drawing upon our schema. So remember that schema are these packages of information based on our past experiences. This is quite a tricky perceptual illusion. Some people see an old lady, other people see a young lady, and some of you might be able to see both. Now this is the case because we store templates of age, and we draw on those templates, on those schema, to make a best guess regarding this lady's age. So I'll try and give you some clues. It's a bit difficult through audio, but if you saw the young woman, the black bit is her hair, and then she's got like a sort of feather in her hair, and she's got a little button nose, and then she's got a sort of pointy chin. If you see the old lady, she's got a very big nose, and then the chin is the bottom bit before you get the sort of black fur. Sorry, that's very vague and it's probably not helped some of you, but keep staring at it and you might be able to see both the young and the old lady within the same image. Another lesson that we can learn from psychological research is how significant culture is on influencing our perceptions. And what psychologists do is they devise these perceptual illusions, and then they take them across the world to different cultures and they ask people what they see. So hopefully you formed an instant reaction of this one. Some people see the duck, other people see the rabbit, and that depends in part, they believe, on your cultural exposure. Obviously, if you've never seen a duck before, or if you're more familiar with rabbits, that might be the animal that you see first. But this is known as a bistable image, because you won't see both at the same time, and your brain will normally flip between the two of them. Again, your cultural background will influence what you see here and how you interpret the image. Now, if you press your mouse, the image will flip. So one way you see the bird with something in its mouth, and the other way you see the boat with a man in it and a fish. Now, this is an impossible picture to interpret, isn't it? Because when you look at it, you want the elephant to have 4 legs, but often people will tell me there's 6 or there's 8. And it's really a very difficult image for your brain to interpret. It's impossible because when you follow the lines down, you see the the four legs, but then you really discover that the feet are actually spaces between them. And this is a flat 2D picture. And in the West, we find it very, very difficult to interpret this picture because we're so used to 3D images. Now, that is not the same picture worldwide, and psychologists have found different results when they've shown this image across the world. This is another famous visual illusion, and it's called the Muller-Lyer illusion. So some of you may already have seen this. Now, the correct answer is that they're both the same length. And Western reasoning tells us this. But when this illusion has been taken across the world to other cultures, they do tend to be fooled by it because the wings of the arrowhead draw attention away from the end of the central line. The third lesson that we're going to think about from psychological research on visual illusions is how essential our perceptual ability is for our survival. So this illusion is called the cafe wall illusion. And when you look at it, it doesn't seem as if the lines are straight. The black and white boards are not aligned, and this fools your brain into thinking that they're sloping, when in actual fact, the lines are straight. Now, with this illusion, you may need to stare at it for a couple of minutes for it to actually work. Be careful with this one if you have any conditions like epilepsy. I wouldn't advise looking at it. But when you stare at it for a while, what happens is the rollers start to appear to move. Now, obviously, they don't move, they're completely stationary, but the image has been configured to fool your brain into thinking that they are moving. And the reason why this happens is that the cells in your brain that detect motion begin to fire, and they interpret the rollers as if they are actually moving. Now, the part of the brain that this image activates is usually only activated when you see things move in the real world. And obviously that's going to help you to survive when, for example, a car is driving down the street at a fast speed towards you. And our final lesson is that our sense organs are having to cope with so much incoming information that they do get very tired. This is another one where you have to stare at the cross for quite some time, and you want your eyes to sort of glaze over the image. Now, this is known as the lilac chaser, and again, I wouldn't recommend staring at it if you have any conditions like epilepsy. But this illusion has different impacts on different people. And some people see the lilac dots start chasing each other in a kind of circular motion. For other people, the lilac dots disappear and you start to get green dots. So everybody experiences something sort of slightly different on this one. And what's happening here is that the image is creating an after image, a visual impression that remains on the retina even after an initial stimulus is removed. So psychologists have carried out a lot of research into perception using visual illusions, and there's three main theories about the process of perception, and they are written by psychologists known as Gestalt psychologists, Gibson and Gregory, and that's their surnames. Now, what I want you to do is to research these three psychologists, type them into a search engine. So, for example, type in the Gestalt theory of perception, or Gibson's theory of perception, or Gregory's theory of perception. And I want you to see if you can read the information and summarize one or two ideas put forward by each of them. Because one of the biggest challenges in psychology is taking complex, detailed explanations and cutting them down in a way that makes sense to you. So this will be a good test of your ability to do that. And I would write those one or 2 points down clearly on a piece of paper. So hopefully you've been able to do some research into this and you've looked at these three psychologists. So starting with James Gibson then. So he created a theory that suggested that our perception is direct, it's evolved over time, and therefore that we genetically inherit this ability to decode or to perceive information. It helps us to survive, and without it we would really struggle. But he did agree that this was affected by our psychological and physiological states. So if we're happy or angry or tired or feeling really alert, that will affect whether you are tricked by visual illusions, for example. Then we've got the Gestalt psychologists. So you might have found out that this is a group of German psychologists working in the 1930s. And the word Gestalt actually means form or shape. And they maintain that when it comes to perception, we are cheats. We do the least amount of processing possible. And so they developed these laws of perception which allow us to do minimal processing. For example, the laws of similarity, closure and proximity. And then finally Richard Gregory. So Gregory argued that we rely very heavily on our previous experiences. So that goes back to the notion of schema that I talked about at the start of this presentation, that we need clues, and those clues give us information to help us to make sense of something. And those previous experiences are unconscious. Often we're not even aware that we're actually referring to them or using them. And they help us to make these instant automatic judgments to give us a probable solution to a situation, or in the case of visual illusions, an image that we haven't seen before, and they allow us to make a best guess. When we study topics in class, we always end by thinking about the real-world applications of psychological research. So in other words, how can this research help to make people's lives better? How can it be used to improve our lives? And I'm going to give you a few examples just to end our taster on perception. So this first one is about the yellow lines that are painted across the roads, and you often see those painted as you lead up to a roundabout. And through the research on visual perception, they were able to establish that if drivers cross the lines that are progressively more closely spaced at a constant speed, drivers actually think they are going faster than they are, and it leads them to slow down. And undoubtedly this will have prevented many accidents. So we've got a recent example here. In 2018 in St John's Wood, northwest London, the UK's first 3D zebra crossing was created, which you can see in the picture. This, of course, is an optical illusion, and it creates a floating effect. So drivers think that there are actually sort of cement barriers in the road, and it causes them to slow down as they approach the zebra crossing. So just to draw all this together before we move on to thinking about the course that we follow at Buller's Wood, what I wanted to illustrate to you is that perceiving is different from seeing, that our vision is not the same as our perception. And I hope what you've gathered from this is that perception isn't straightforward. The brain confuses, it muddles, it adjusts what we visually take in, it adjusts those physical properties that are received from the world around us. And it is an active processor. It uses hypotheses, expectations, and stored knowledge to make sense of the world around us. At Buller's Wood, we follow the AQA specification for psychology. This specification involves you taking 3 exams at the end of the second year. Each of those exam papers is a 2-hour-long paper, and each is equally weighted. Now, this exam paper has multiple choice questions. It will have short answer questions that are usually worth 1 to 4, sometimes 3 and 6 marks. And then you will also be required to complete extended writing questions. Now that's really essays. So in psychology, the maximum mark for an essay is 16 marks, and usually you would have 20 minutes to write one of those essays, and most individuals write between 3 and 4 A4 sides in an exam situation in that time period. So as I said, there are 3 exams for psychology, and these are the topics that are assessed in paper 1. So we've got social influence, which looks at things like conformity, obedience, minority influence and social change. Memory, which is looking at the nature and structure of short-term and long-term memory, why we forget, and then it focuses on eyewitness testimony and whether eyewitnesses are accurate in their recall of events. Attachment, so that's looking at the emotional bond that forms between a parent and their child. We look at how that develops, what happens if that bond is broken, and also what would be the subsequent impact of our early attachment experiences on our adult relationships. And the final topic in paper 1 is psychopathology. So that is looking at mental health, thinking about how we define someone as having an abnormality, and then we go on to look at the characteristics, explanations and treatments of 3 disorders: obsessive compulsive disorder, phobias and depression. Now you'll notice that in paper 2 there are only 3 topics, and that's because research method is more heavily weighted than any of the other topics in psychology. It's actually worth double the amount of marks, and that's because a lot of the maths assessment will be made here. So we've got research methods, which looks at the methodology that's used by psychologists to carry out their investigations. So we look at how to devise and carry out an effective interview, questionnaire, experiment, observation, case study, etc. We think about the nature of science and how to carry out research that's valid and reliable. How to handle our data, so how to record it, what sort of tables to use and things like that, and then going on to thinking about statistical analysis of the data. Working upwards, we've got biopsychology, so this is the biological unit within psychology. We look at the nervous system, we look at the structure and function of neurons and how neurotransmitters are involved in the process of passing messages from one neuron to another. We study the endocrine or hormone system and the fight or flight response. We then go on to think about localization and lateralization of brain function. So that's looking at what the different parts of the brain are and what function they perform. We look at the types of brain scans that are available and biological rhythms, which is our bodily rhythms, including things like the sleep-wake cycle. And then the top topic there is the different approaches in psychology. So this covers the main theories within psychology. Finally, we have paper 3. So we're back to 4 topic areas in this paper. Everybody has to study issues and debates in psychology, which looks at themes that run through the whole of psychology. And then we have 3 options. Now, teachers decide which of those options to teach year on year, so they may change by the time you get into year 13. But currently we offer relationships, forensic psychology, and schizophrenia. Just a few points to consider when you're making your subject choices for A-level. In terms of psychology, don't choose to do psychology unless you're prepared for a lot of writing. As I said on the previous slide, psychology isn't all about sitting and discussing. There's a lot of note-taking in lessons. We'll be writing down theories, we'll be writing down evaluation points in appeal format. You need to be fairly competent at essay writing. So in every exam you will complete a minimum of one essay, but that is a minimum. There have been papers in the past where you've had to write 3 essays in one singular exam. Recognise there's lots of names and dates, so in that respect it's a little bit like history. You'll be learning hundreds of names of psychologists and when their studies were done, as well as the detail on the studies. Make sure you like the application of maths and statistics, because there is a whole section that involves data analysis. Make sure you also enjoy the human side of biology, because we do go over quite a bit of the biology from GCSE and then we extend that in the biopsychology topic. And also make sure that you really are willing to work very hard. We get really good results at Bullers, but we expect our students to put a lot of effort in, and that will help them to be successful. These are our GCSE entry requirements for this coming academic year. Because of the mathematical and biological content in psychology, as well as the normal entry criteria for Bullers, you will specifically need to have grade 5s or above in English language, maths and science. Just a bit more information regarding mathematical requirements of psychology A-level on this slide. So you can see there that the maths is worth 10% of the overall assessment. That means 10% of the questions and marks in psychology will be maths based. And you can see a list there of a lot of the maths skills that you will need to be competent at in order to pass those sorts of questions. If you are not studying Maths A-level or have not received a grade 7 or above in GCSE Maths, we will put on extra maths lessons for you after school. It's not obligatory to buy a textbook for Psychology A-level, but many of our students do like to buy their own copy of it. We do have a set that we use in class, but they cannot be taken out of the classroom. If you do decide to buy it, this is the one that we would recommend. It's quite well known as the Green-Haired Girl book for obvious reasons, but the information is down there. I think they are at the moment working on bringing out a new edition, so you might find that in the next month or so a new version comes out, but it will be pretty much the same. It costs about £25, but if you look now you'll probably find some second-hand copies being sold on sites like eBay, and you might be able to get it a bit cheaper. So if you do decide to come to Bullerswood and study psychology, then make sure that you complete summer work for our subject. You'll be able to find it on the website. It's under the sixth form section, and it's a Word document that has 5 different tasks to complete, all introducing you to the research methods and ideas of psychological theorists.